Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Before introducing today's guest, I want to mention that this will be the last podcast of 2008. We'll take a break next week and return on January 5th, 2009. A happy and healthy new year to all our listeners out there. My guest today is George Srour, founder and executive director of Building Tomorrow, a charity that builds schools in Africa. George, welcome to EconTalk.
Thank you.
So tell us what Building Tomorrow does and how it got started.
Well, Building Tomorrow is a social profit organization that works with university students and young people really all over the United States to raise awareness and also build schools in Uganda at the present time that serve vulnerable children. And we got our start as an organization that was really born out of an experience that I had working for the United Nations World Food Program and having the opportunity to visit a number of different schools throughout central Uganda that were really in pretty poor shape, and after doing a little bit of research, realized how far money can go in a developing country versus the United States. And so the idea was to essentially raise $10,000 to rebuild a particular school that I had seen during my senior year of college, and the hope was to raise this money in between Thanksgiving and Christmas. And our goal was $10,000. We ended up raising $45,000, and out of that was really born this idea that there were a lot of young people out there who wanted to make a tangible difference in the world, but just perhaps didn't have a medium through which to do it. And
so you were going to raise $10,000 in a pretty short period of time.
Yep. Which
is actually a rather large sum of money to raise for a project that had never been executed before.
Right.
So did you raise the $45,000 in that same time period?
Correct.
And when you were raising the money, what did you tell people the money was going toward?
We just explained the project, which was we were going to rebuild a school that had been completely built by timber, and because of termites in that part of the world and the climate would pretty much fall apart once or twice a year and would have to be rebuilt.
So you told people this, and that sounds pretty horrible.
Right.
And they gave you money?
And, we had it set up through the College of William and Mary, which is where I was a student, and the university was able to accept funds on our behalf and then send them over. So there was a bit of credibility in that the college had its name behind it, and that's where people were sending their money.
And where was the money going to actually, when people asked if they did, how was that money going to go from the school to get into a different kind of building? What was going to cause that transformation, that building to actually get built? What was the original plan?
Yeah, I mean, we knew that the school meeting point, which is the school that we ended up giving the money to, we knew that they had plans. We knew that they had a couple of NGOs that were working with them on the ground.
NGOs meaning non-governmental
organizations,
yeah,
correct?
Private charity type things.
Groups that we knew were quite credible and trustworthy, and that we could send the money to, and that they would make sure that the project would be completed.
And so you raised $45,000. How much money did the school really just need the $10,000?
The school needed $10,000 for the initial design, but what had happened was that we raised $45,000, and on top of that, another Italian NGO came in and gave another $200,000, which was then used to essentially build up. So our money covered the cost of the classrooms that were built on the first floor of this new school, and then the next two, the next two floors that ended up being built were completely funded through this NGO.
And give us a little bit of the timing. So which This was Thanksgiving of what year?
This is Thanksgiving of 2004, which was my senior year.
So this is 4 years ago. So how long did it take that school to get built?
We opened the school in May of 2006.
Okay.
So roughly, between 14 and 16 months from the time that we actually got going on construction.
So that was great.
Yep.
And you felt good about that. And why wasn't that the end of the story?
Well, one of the things, as I began to do a little bit more research, I started to realize the disparity between the number of kids in the U.S. who go to school every day, and that number is about 38 million, and the number of kids in sub-Saharan Africa who don't go to school. And at the time, that was 46 million, and now that number has been revised to 41 million. In either case, you still have more kids in sub-Saharan Africa who don't go to school than those who do in the States. And for me, that was just kind of a wake-up call, because people who I've kind of looked up to, I think, as just really inspiring people in the world, and Desmond Tutu, who's our honorary chairman, certainly fits that bill, keep coming back to the idea that education is what's going to be the fundamental change that will allow countries like Uganda and others to really progress and get themselves out of the continuous cycles of poverty that have kind of afflicted the countries. And so, to me, it was seeing that and kind of doing a little bit of research, I realized that what we really needed to do was not only put some money in education, but we needed to go where no one else had gone before and try and build schools in areas that were extremely depressed and had huge amounts of children who had never stepped foot in a classroom before.
And so what was the next step? You built a school, and that's nice. Then you realized there are other kids who could use the school. So
right.
How'd you proceed from there?
Well, what we did was we ended up going through, I applied for a couple of different fellowships that would allow me to have the necessary funds to at least get started. And I was able to get one called the Simon Fellowship for Noble Purpose. And after graduating and spending the summer working in Washington, I came back to Indianapolis, which is where I grew up, and said, okay, we've got this money, how do we get this started? And a lot of my time was spent meeting with people who'd maybe been down this road before, who had been involved in some form of social entrepreneurship, and also obviously had a lot to figure out on the Uganda end. Was very fortunate to follow up with a number of contacts that I had made throughout the course of my internship with the World Food Program, to meet with folks and speak with others on the phone about what it would take on the ground. It became very evident very quickly that we needed a staff and we needed someone to represent us in Uganda. And so the first couple months were really spent trying to find out who that person was, and then travel to Uganda to meet with them.
And then?
From there, I think the first thing that I learned is you've got to always, we might have great ideas, but sometimes the best ones come from folks on the ground. And we had a number of discussions where we went through what we thought would be the model for Building Tomorrow, which was to rebuild existing schools similar to what we had done in the first go-around. But we realized and did some more research to figure out that where we really needed, again, was in areas that hadn't had access to schools before.
And so you started to do what? How'd you get that launched?
From there, we essentially said, okay, if we're going to do this, and we're going to do this in a sustainable way, we needed to work with the government, and any organization that goes into a country and says they're going to work with the government probably gets looked at in a funny way, because the governments in that part of the world aren't necessarily seen as being the most efficient or transparent.
Correct.
But we realized that schools in one sense, can definitely put politicians between a rock and a hard place. Because if you build a school and open it and there are no teachers in it, the first person that a member of the community is going to complain to is going to be their member of their local representative.
Sure.
And before you know it, there's going to be enough of a clamor that there's going to actually be some extreme, distaste among the community and a big movement to actually staff the school. And Uganda's unique in the sense that it was one of the first countries to adopt universal primary education as an initiative of the government, and to a large extent, it's helped bring in many more kids into schools. At the same time, it hasn't been as effective, I think, as many people would like it to be, because it's led to very crowded classrooms, and the quality has not necessarily been as high as it ought to be. But we realized that to create something sustainable, it wasn't going to be able. We weren't going to be able to just build a school and not build a school and have a community in the United States actually fund the ongoing costs, including salaries for teachers and so forth. So we realized that we needed to partner up with the government and use this UPE funding to our advantage.
What's that?
The Universal Primary Education Initiative.
Their budget, what they had going.
Right.
So now let me be skeptical here before we go any further. There are a lot of organizations that have funded schools in poor parts of the world, and I think the general effect of those has been quite small. In that, either, as you point out, you have a school, but you don't have teachers, or you have a school and you don't have kids, or you have a school and teachers and the kids, but the teachers aren't very good, so the kids don't learn very much. Or the worst case, you have a school, you have teachers, you have the kids, but there aren't many opportunities in the economy, so the kids are better off, unfortunately, not going to school, and they stop showing up after a while. So what is your confidence, having people on the ground there and having, I assume, been there numerous times in Uganda, how do you know you're having an impact? One of the things that fascinated me about your story is, well, one, the ease at which you were able to achieve some of these goals, which I think is very, very inspiring. But of course, we want more than just you raised $45,000, more than just you built a school. How do you know, and how do you try to make sure that you're having an impact on the children rather than just building a building?
Well, it's a very valid question, and one that I would be quite frank with you and say that we're still trying to figure out how we answer that. What's different, though, I think, if you build a well and the well begins to work and you're pumping clean water, you can immediately see an impact in the health of children and others in the community. A school's ability to make an impact, I think, is much more prolonged because we're talking about a school that is going to go from 1st to 7th grade, and at present, even the ones that we've opened right now don't have all 7 grades because none of these kids that we're working with are at a point at which they can go into the top class. So I think being able to look at what the impact can be is right now is one of the things that we're spending a lot of time doing. And a couple of different things that I would mention is that instead of just us coming in and building the school on our own, the significant part of the equation is that the community provides over 25,000 hours of labor.
Yeah, talk about that, because that's the thing that also attracted me to your story. So talk about how that works and how you got that started. Has it changed, or is it kind of the way it started? And tell me how that's going.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things where Joseph, our country director, said, we need to ask the community to build a school, and I completely didn't believe that there was any chance that they would actually do it. And again, this is where I realized I just needed to, take a back seat at some point and allow our in-country staff to flesh this out. But what we've realized is that having that community component is extremely important. We certainly don't construct schools as quickly as we would be able to if we were paying all of the laborers. But what we know is true is that there is a huge sense of pride amongst the parents and even sometimes the kids who come out to help and build, because they have, they're actively engaged and involved in the process. And, we've actually had a situation where a parent was attending a kind of a debate of local government officials who were running for re-election. One of them took credit for one of the schools that we built, and she got up, and this was her telling the story afterwards. She got up and said, you actually had nothing to do with this. This was an organization that came to us, and us as a community decided that, yes, we needed a school here, and we were going to work together to make it happen. And so when you look at the overall impact, you kind of see the empowerment that gave, especially this woman, but an entire community, to feel like they may not have the funds to pay school fees, but they have the ability to contribute their labor to actually construct a school where their kids can come.
Now, your first thought would be, as an outsider, well, it's a nice idea having the parents volunteer, but what do they know about building a school? So besides taking a little bit longer, is there quality issues? How do you get those? We have
a foreman who is paid, who's essentially a general contractor, and he's the one that he and if he needs to at certain points, it definitely provides the guidance, and we don't. The roofing, let's say, of the school is not done by unskilled laborers. The critical points are certainly done by tradesmen who are definitely qualified to do that work. But at the same time, it's interesting because over the course of a construction project, you see one of the biggest enemies that we have is that of trust. You work in a country like Uganda, in communities which have oftentimes been promised something before, either by someone, either by a Western person or organization, or even a Ugandan who's come through and said they're going to take a collection to build a hospital or whatnot, and they take the money and they run. And what we find is that when we first say we're going to do this and the community signs on, you have a small amount of people who are showing up to help dig the foundation because they don't believe that you're actually going to have the money to be able to complete the project. And as things continue and as the project goes on, there are more and more people who start showing up. And one of the sites that we were at in October, there was a gentleman, a kid who's in secondary school, so our equivalent of high school, and he said he started showing up not only to the construction site but the mobilization meetings because he was very fortunate, was able to get a scholarship to attend a secondary school nearby, but he has 3 sisters who don't have the chance to go to school. And he said, I'm coming here every day after school to give my sisters a chance to do what I've done. And so I think that the element of getting the community involved has been very important in terms of allowing people to see that even though they may not have deep pockets and be able to afford school fees and uniforms and so forth, that they can still contribute in a positive way to give their kids a shot at getting an education.
I just think that's incredibly important. I think that's the cleverest and maybe the most important part of the project. One of the there's a big debate in the United States about how do we make our schools better, and some people want to spend more money. And we've been doing that for about 40 years. We've been increasing expenditures per pupil at a rather staggering rate. And we haven't had much success. And, one possibility is that things would be much, much worse if we hadn't spent the money. The fact that things have gotten worse while we spent the money doesn't mean that the money caused the bad things to happen. But other people have suggested that the way we spend the money is the problem. And I've started to wonder about the importance of the fact that our public school system is generally without charge to the students and to the parents. There is a charge, of course. There is a cost. Nothing is free. The cost is collected in the form of property taxes, typically in the United States, and some federal funding, local property tax and federal funding. But the fact that it's given away from the perspective of the parents, the fact that whether you go or don't go doesn't change how much you pay, has to be part of the problem. And one of the insights of the private school system is that, for example, I remember a conversation I had with the head of the Catholic school system of St. Louis, and she said that every student, almost all the students, were on some kind of scholarship. Very few people could carry their own weight in terms of tuition, but nobody got a full scholarship. Nobody paid zero. Every parent of every kid in there had to make some tangible monetary contribution to their kid's education, and the theory was that generated some kind of buy-in. And it's sort of a reverse version. I'm not quite sure what the analogy is, but it's a version of Milton Friedman's insight that you spend your own money on yourself very carefully, and you spend other people's money on other people very uncarefully. And the analogy is that when you're spending your own money, you take care of stuff that's given to you. You don't take quite the same amount of care. And so I think that has to be a huge factor in some of your success.
Well, I mean, one of the things that we have, once the school gets going, we set up parent-teacher committees, kind of like a PTA or a PTO, whatever, it's called in the States. And what's really interesting is to see how parents handle the issue of lunches. It's known that kids obviously perform much better when they're well fed, and in some of the communities that we're working in, that's just simply kids oftentimes will skip a meal and so forth. And so parents have come to us and our staff on the ground and said, well, are you going to feed them? And we have said consistently, no, that's for you, the parents, to figure out. And at a couple schools, what's happened is that the parents have decided a certain cost that a family needs to pay per term, and there are 3 terms in the year. And what's been neat to see is that in some cases where a family or a parent cannot pay the cost in cash, the parents have begun to figure out, well, what's that contribution mean, let's say, in maize, or what's that contribution in hours? So you might not be able to afford to pay, but if you come and actually cook porridge 3 times a week, then for us that's good. And obviously you can't. Obviously, there's a cost to the materials that go into creating the porridge, and not everybody can pay in an alternative way. But we really feel like those kinds of experiences that the parents are getting, and the discussions that they're having amongst themselves are very important in the overall transformation that we hope a school provides within a community.
So you're not just building the building; you are continuing to run the school. We have fashion.
So the schools are built on land that we've purchased, and the schools belong to us. The government technically leases the school from us for free, or for a very nominal fee. And the reason we do that is obviously we want to protect our donors who have given money and want to make sure that the school itself is going to be used as a school for a long time. So
the World Bank might learn a lesson from that. But yeah, go ahead. So that's the way you do it,
right? So that's important to us, and because eventually what we see and what we think we can get to is that every one of our schools is built on at least 3 acres of land, and some up to 7. And we're working in very agrarian areas in a country that can harvest twice a year because of its location. And we know that if we really spent some time developing a vocational training program in agriculture, that it's not inconceivable that we could have a profit-generating school that essentially pays for itself and its teachers through the crop that it produces. And not only will it generate income, but it will also teach what we think is a very valuable skill to kids who may not end up going into the city or working in a corporate environment, but they'll have at least, they'll be able to do more than subsistence farming, which is something that we feel can, again, continue to empower the community and raise the stock of the folks who live there. So, that's kind of our ultimate goal, and we're trying to look at ways in which maybe in the future, before we actually build schools, we're looking at an incremental design system where instead of building the whole school all at once, we build classroom by classroom and get the buy-in from the community, not so much in the labor to construct the school, but the labor to till the fields and take care of the fields so that we can begin to generate income at a much earlier point in the timeline of the school.
It's creative. I'm not sure it'll work, but it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, I mean, we're, I think that the possibilities are there for something like that to be successful, based on what we've seen in a few other case studies and a couple other schools in the area. So, that's something that we definitely want to continue looking at.
So how many schools have you built now total?
In total, we have 3 that are up and running, and 2 more that are in the midst of construction, and 2 more that will begin construction of in January.
I should mention, by the way, that one of the reasons that I got interested in the story is I saw some photographs of people starting to build the school, mm-hmm. and I thought they were very inspiring, incredible, and very moving. And I hope we can put a link up to some of those pictures. But, in the beginning of a process, there's always a lot of excitement and enthusiasm. It's harder to sustain that over the course of many, many months where the work is physically demanding and inevitably, like we talked about digging the foundation and bricklaying, I assume, is part of it. And that's also, it's not thrilling work. Of course, it can be thrilling if you think of it as taking care of your kids. So I'm just curious, have you had some disappointments, things that went wrong, or setbacks along the way as some of that initial enthusiasm waned?
Yeah, I mean, I think you over the course of a construction project that can take up to a year, you definitely have really frustrating moments. I mean, we were supposed to open 2 schools in February of this year, and they didn't open till June. And you look at, I was very frustrated, but I think frustrated from the sense that I'm looking at it through the lens of being someone who lives in the States. When you sit down with the staff in Uganda and you start to look at why things took so long and why things were late and so on and so forth, it actually comes down to something, it comes down to a number of deaths in the community, be it malaria or HIV or whatnot, and the local custom that you take 3 days off every time someone in the community has passed away. And all of a sudden, if you were to light up a calendar with the days off that people had to take for that reason, you're looking at probably a death at least once every 2 weeks in the greater community that completely halted work.
How big is the community that we're talking about?
So, well,
how many kids, and are there other schools, or is this the only one?
Yeah, I mean, so we do a kind of a needs assessment before we actually decide to look at a community and figure out if there's a potential for us to build a school there. And we look at things. We look at it kind of in a greater context in terms of how far, up to 2 kilometers of a walk from the site that kids would walk to get to the school. So some areas have about 10 villages, and maybe each village has, could have 100 people or so that make it up. One thing that's unique about Uganda is that it's the youngest country in the world. Half of its population is under the age of 15.
Wow.
So even in places where we're building a school that's eventually going to serve 325 kids, a couple places have what we were able to find, at least in our needs assessment. We found them to have at least 600 kids who don't have access to school. So we're trying to meet a need, but we're still not even being able to serve everybody. So
what happens?
Well, it's kind of a motivator for parents and so forth to come and work, because we give preference for enrollment to the school based on who comes to help build. So, you find that you have a lot of people who show up because they know that there's something in it for them.
That's great. Incentives matter. They
right.
do. So, you've built, I think I get the numbers right. You've built 3. You got 2 more about to come online. Is that what you said? And that gets us to 5. How many do you want to build?
Well, we're on pace to have 10 built and open by 2010, and I think one of the things that we're looking at is what does happen to a student when they finish primary school.
Mm-hmm.
We know that there are some pretty big benefits. Girls, for instance, their likelihood of contracting HIV/AIDS are cut in half if they get to 7th grade, and that's all fine and well. But what more can we do past that? So
pretty good. It's a great start.
Yeah, we've had. It's not uncommon for someone who has completed 7th grade to be able to get a job that sustains them in Uganda. But we do want to do more. But we just want to. I've always been careful not to want to do too much too fast, because I think we need to be able to get down what we're working on right now pretty well before we start looking at perhaps the possibility of maybe working in perhaps working in secondary schools and providing some sort of continuation for these students. Sure. or what. So.
Well, I think one of the lessons we've learned from William Easterly's work, which another thing that attracted me to your project, is it's not very grand, which is a plus, not a minus. It's a feature, not a bug. You're not trying to transform the educational system of Uganda in 18 months or 2 years. You're going to help 300 kids get a better education.
Right.
And every little bit helps, and that's not actually a little bit. So it is, I don't mean to suggest it's not grand. It's somewhat grand, but it's not grandiose.
Right.
And I think that is the key to successful social entrepreneurship.
Yeah, I think, one of the most profound pieces of advice I think I've gotten is that, social entrepreneurship is a marathon, it's not a sprint. So, the work that we're doing, if you are, you got to realize that there's a lot to what we're doing, and we don't have to. I don't think we need to be able to put every kid in Uganda in school to count ourselves successful at the end of the day.
Well, I think you'd probably be unsuccessful because it's easy to do that badly. I think that's the most
right.
interesting challenge of this kind of transformational effort.
Mm-hmm.
Is most people measure success by dollars raised or dollars spent or size of staff or kids in school, and those are not the right measures. And I think most charitable activities founder struggle and fail because they get into a problem of trying to measure stuff that's the wrong stuff to measure. It's good to measure stuff. It's really important so that you can try to quantify how well you're doing and improve. But if you start paying attention to the wrong things, you end up forgetting your mission. And I think it's a huge challenge of every organization.
Mm-hmm. mean, I think our mission initially was to work on the bricks and mortar and to build the schools, but I think what we've found is that we feel like we have a place to do a little bit more, and that we have the opportunity to do that using the school as kind of the central place for a community.
Yeah, just be careful because it gets harder, right? Specialization's a really good thing, and what you're good at might just be building those schools with the parents' input. I mean, that's a huge thing.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I mean, we definitely don't want to, we don't want to stretch it ourselves too thin, and I think I mentioned that before.
Yeah, that's important.
But I think, we want to look at, we want to look at what aspects of education we can do well at, and see how those might play in and benefit the community at large. So
you're sitting in we're having this conversation I think today's December 11th. Is that right? Or the 10th?
I think it's
today's
10th.
The 10th, yeah.
Yep.
I'm sitting here in Virginia, and you're sitting in Indianapolis, Indiana,
mm-hmm.
which is pretty far from Uganda.
Yep.
In many dimensions, one of which being miles, but there are others. How are you staying on top of this, and how often do you go there? What's your day-to-day activities like in running this organization, and what are the virtues and challenges of being that far away?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think my strength is not to be in country 24/7. In Uganda, the price of land for someone who shows up from the West is probably 3 or 4 times what it is for somebody who's Ugandan. And we work a lot in purchasing things and making deals with different people and working with the government and so forth. So in a way, it's best for me not to be there and to have a staff on the ground who's fully competent and capable of taking care of everything. We try and keep in touch at least weekly with our Uganda staff, who spends a lot of their time out of an office and actually in the field. And I spend a lot of my days working kind of fundraising on a number of different levels, but also taking care of a lot of the administrative things, which when I first began an organization, had absolutely no idea that there was so much to be done.
Surprise, yeah.
Yeah, and most of it, a lot of it, you feel like pertains very little to the actual program side of what we do, but it's just kind of the nature of the beast, I suppose. So I don't think any 2 days or any 2 weeks are alike, but I go about 3 times a year to Uganda and do a considerable amount of traveling within the U.S., either working with our campus chapters or trying to meet with donors and so forth.
Let's go back to this, just a side comment you made, but which is very poignant and important, which is death in those places. Are you going to work on malaria and AIDS and those kind of issues since they're so tied into people's lives in those communities that you're working in?
Yeah, I think Russ, that kind of brings up the point about what's our strength and where are we fit to do the best job that we can. Malaria, in one sense, is perhaps an easier issue to deal with because a lot of times, a bed net or a simple treatment can help, can really make a difference between life and death for a kid. HIV/AIDS is a completely different story, just because of the treatments, the medical treatments that are required, and the cost to those as well. So we have a couple funders who are interested in looking at what we might be able to do to improve the health of kids at our schools, and we certainly realize that health is an important aspect of them doing well in school. But at the same time, we're just trying to figure out what's appropriate for us to get ourselves involved with.
And I think that's the right attitude.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a couple folks who've been to Uganda and have maybe left money to deworm the kids or something very basic. And when it's come time to actually have that done, the community has been very kind of has looked at things in a very suspect way because they don't realize that. They may not trust the pill that's being taken.
Sure.
Or they may not even know about, or they may not even realize that kids need to be dewormed, and that's an actual issue.
Sure.
So there are just a lot of cultural things that, if you want to talk about negatives of sitting in Indianapolis, it's difficult perhaps to convey to a well-intentioned donor that some of these things have to be figured out and discussed before we can actually move forward with those ideas.
So, a related issue would be, what parents' alternatives are. And in some or most of these communities that you're dealing with, that you're involved with, are you the only school?
We're the only formal school. There are, in some cases, schools that have been operating for a long time but without any authorization from the Department of Education or the Ministry of Education. So they are open, they're running, and they're kind of like a glorified daycare because they provide a place for kids to go, but the kids will not be able to take exams to pass from primary to secondary school.
Because
they're not accredited, they don't have teachers that have obtained certification. The schools are not in any good shape, and a number of other issues.
So for you, in your schools or in the other government schools that are there, are all those things in place? I mean, certification to me is, in America, is a great barrier to education. I am allowed to teach. I can teach in any college in America pretty much. I happen to have a PhD, but there are colleges where you can teach with a master's degree or probably nothing at all as an adjunct or another format. Whereas in America's government-run schools, you have to be certified, which unfortunately is not particularly related to being a good teacher. It would be nice if it were. Then you could at least make the case, but there are many public schools in the United States where the teachers, of course, are not very good, and certification had no value or impact. It's mainly a hoop to jump through, as far as I can tell, to discourage too many people from being teachers. So is that the case in Uganda as well? Do you think certification there is a positive or just a hoop?
Well, I would say it's probably a bit of both. I mean, it's good to, I think in one sense what the certification process does do is that it reaffirms that you actually really want to do this for a living. Because I think as maybe some teachers would agree in the States, it's not exactly, in some cases, it's not the most glamorous of jobs. So you get people who do enjoy that interaction with kids. At the same time, I mean, I think by virtue of being in Uganda, there are a number of, there are a number of systems that in place that are simply left over from being a British protectorate or whatever else that really today don't have much relevance. And so I think the national certification program that's used in Uganda is probably a bit out of date and could use a significant overhaul. And that's why one of the people that we have on our staff is someone who is a teacher trainer, in a sense, to be able to help reinforce some of the things that we feel teachers should be able to know or to know and do in a classroom.
Yeah, running a classroom's a challenge in and of itself. Then there's the subject matter, and then there's the motivating. I mean, it's an enormously underappreciated job. What does a teacher in Uganda earn?
About $100 a month.
And how does that compare to the average worker in Uganda?
Well, I think average income is like $285 a year or something like that.
So teachers is a very good paying job.
Yeah, they do well, but they also have they have one of the issues that comes up where we're working is teacher housing, because we're not living, we're not in an urban setting where there are plenty of opportunities for housing. So we've had to look at how we could provide some sort of whether it might be a bike to get a teacher back and forth to a place where there is decent housing, or work with folks in the community to be able to open up some options for housing. So there are a lot of issues surrounding teachers, and then making, again, it's nice that you built a school, but how can you make sure that the quality of education is where you want it to be?
Maybe you need an apartment building on that 7 acres.
So, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different options. I think one thing that our model is good at is that it provides a tangible result to the university chapters that we work with that can, at the end of the day, point to something that they've done.
Yep.
At the same time, it's a bit of a hindrance because there's we can say it costs $45,000 to build a school, and that seems like something that's pretty attainable at a college campus, especially a large college campus that might have that many students. So if you get everybody to give you $1, you've built a school. And we want to be careful because as you continue to add things, you might, we might portray the idea of building a school as being something that's out of the league of a lot of young people that we're working with. We don't necessarily want to do that. We obviously want to make sure that the school's good, but we don't want to alienate people when it comes to, giving them the opportunity to get involved in something like this. So we're trying to evaluate what makes the most sense for us in terms of is it providing that housing or providing a means to transport themselves to that kind of housing or what?
So what proportion of your funding comes from individual college students?
Well, currently 100% of what we...
And how many chapters do you have?
Well, we have about 15 college chapters now. And most of the funding that supports the schools themselves comes from those college students, and we do separate fundraising to take care of the administrative costs of the organization.
So that's to cover your salary, the people on the ground there.
Right.
And have you been imitated? Are there other college activities going on doing other, what you might call micro social entrepreneurship like this?
Well, I think what we found, especially at William & Mary, was after this took off, our William & Mary chapter probably has one of the hardest times raising money because the project that we did, Christmas in Kampala, I think was kind of an indication to a lot of people that we could, or something like this could be done. So you've had a lot of different programs pop up on campuses like that. But one of the things that I think distinguishes the organization is that our main target is young people in terms of getting them involved. I think if you look at organizations like Habitat for Humanity and some of these others that still do good work, Save the Children, World Vision, whatever, their main target in terms of donors has been people, older people with deeper pockets, which, we certainly don't turn away here, but our main goal is to try and work with young people. And I think that distinguishes us in the sense that that's where we really began.
How long do you think you'll be doing this?
Personally? That's a great question. Who knows?
You want to do it for 20 years?
I don't know. I think
is it fun?
A month before I graduated college, I had no idea what I was going to do. So I'm kind of I'm one to just roll with the punches and see where things lead.
Is it fun?
It is. I think some days more so than others, but you certainly have a lot of different challenges and a lot of different things to deal with day in, day out, and I enjoy that because there isn't anything that's routine.
What's been the most frustrating part of this experience and the most rewarding?
Well, the most frustrating is certainly, I think, seeing, you can read stories, let's say, about corruption and where money is being spent in Uganda, and I think to myself, well, why am I doing what I'm doing if people within the country can't even figure out where best to put their money? And I think it's very frustrating when you look at it in that sense, because you feel like people ought to compliment the work that you're doing by making better decisions with where money goes, instead of buying a new private jet for the president or whatever it is. But at the same time, what's I think most rewarding about it is when you walk into a classroom and you see a kid, right up on the board, how do fish breathe? And he's looking out to his classmates and his teacher looking for an answer. And to know that we've kind of created that space where those questions can be asked and imaginations can kind of be triggered and smarts hopefully improved. It's very exciting to see that, and it's also really rewarding to see and talk with students on this side of the water who've been involved with our work, who've maybe traveled to Uganda and have completely changed their direction of what they wanted to do, to fall more in line with some of the experiences that they've had with us.
How many students have made that trip, do you think, roughly?
We've taken probably 40 kids over the last 2 years, and we've got another trip coming up in January.
And what do they do when they go?
They participate in the construction, in the builds that are on site. They do a homestay with the family, Uganda, just to get a sense for what that's like, and so that it's a very packed 2 weeks, but I think it's also a very eye-opening one for many folks who've never been to Africa or some who've never left the country.
I'm sure. In closing, what advice do you have for people who want to change the world, as someone who has changed the world?
I don't know if I would go that far. Well, I would say just be very diligent about what you want to do, and also persistent. I think a lot of people, when I first got started working in the upstairs of my parents' house, thought that this was all kind of this just wasn't going to work. And
your parents were probably two of those people, or may have been.
And not, but I thrive off of that, so it's not like I really mind, and in a way I think that's what drives a lot of people. But I think over time, if I look at what our initial goal was in terms of what we wanted to do and how we were going to do it, we've done a complete 180 in terms of the methodology we were going to use to get to that point.
How so?
Well, just in the sense that, we thought we were going to come in and build schools for existing schools, and that we were going to have them built all ourselves, and that we were just going to do bricks and mortar and walk away. And I think we've totally switched that around in terms of saying we're going to actually start new schools. We're going to go to places where you've got to drive 5 minutes off a tarmac road to even get close to where we're going to do this. And that has been that's totally different, just because of the constructs and the infrastructure that you have to support that kind of thing. Whereas you could lean on an existing school to give you a plan and design and so forth, we're the ones that actually have to do that and meet with the contractors and get schools approved by the Ministry of Education and so on and so forth. So things are quite different, but I think we've been very persistent at saying education is where we want to work, but we got to continue to be open to the fact that we may not know right at this time what education needs to be successful.
My guest today has been George Srour, founder and executive director of Building Tomorrow. George, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.